Sometimes fate arrives half-frozen in a snowdrift. Luke McCrae had lost his wife 3 winters past and figured his heart was buried deep as any grave in Dakota Territory. That January morning in 1886, riding the mail trail after the worst blizzard in years, his horse shied at something dark against the white. Luke dismounted and dug through the snow with his bare hands, expecting to find a fallen elk, or maybe supplies scattered from an overturned wagon. Instead, he pulled up a young woman wrapped in a torn traveling cloak, her lips blue as winter sky, barely breathing. She was Rose Whitfield, a mail-order bride who'd come west to marry a farmer. That farmer lay dead beneath the wagon wheels, and Rose was fading fast. With sunset coming and the nearest doctor 2 days' ride through impassable drifts, Luke faced a choice that would change everything. The preacher in Timber Butte warned him, marry her tonight to give her legal protection and a warm bed, or watch a stranger die in his arms. But what happens when a marriage born of mercy becomes something neither of them expected? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 hours before Luke McCrae would find Rose Whitfield buried in that snowdrift, he'd been standing in his kitchen, holding a tin cup of coffee that had gone cold while he stared out the frost-etched window at his empty corral. The silence in the house pressed against his ears like cotton batting, thick and suffocating, in the way that only comes when a man has grown too accustomed to being alone. His calloused fingers traced the rim of the cup, a habit he'd developed in the months after Sarah died. She used to fill the morning quiet with her humming, soft melodies that drifted through the house like warmth from the cook stove. Now the only sounds were the creak of settling timber and the occasional pop from the dying embers in the fireplace. Luke set the cup on the rough-hewn table Sarah had insisted they buy from the furniture maker in Deadwood, back when they'd still believed they had time for such luxuries. The wood bore the scars of their life, together ring stains from hot dishes, knife marks from hurried meal preparations. A dark burn mark where Sarah had once set down a pot too quickly while rushing to tend their colicky neighbor's baby Dotette. 42, Luke had the weathered hands of a man who'd spent his life coaxing life from stubborn Dakota soil. His shoulders, broad from years of hefting hay bales and wrestling ornery cattle, carried the weight of 3 winters' worth of solitude. The mirror above the wash basin reflected gray threading through his dark hair, lines etched deeper around his brown eyes, lines that had once crinkled with laughter, but now seemed permanently set in something closer to resignation. The McCrae ranch sat in a valley 12 miles south of Timber Butte, a town that generously counted itself home to 200 souls when the weather was good, enough for everyone to venture out and be counted. Luke's property stretched across 800 acres of rolling grassland that turned golden in summer and white as a fresh sheet in winter. The main house, built from local pine and chinked with prairie mud, stood solid against the constant Dakota wind. A barn, tool shed, and chicken coop completed the cluster of buildings that Sarah had always called their little kingdom. Sarah, even thinking her name brought that familiar tightness in his chest. She'd been gone 3 years come April, taken by a fever that had swept through the territory like a prairie fire. Doc Henderson had done what he could, riding out from town every day for a week, but some things couldn't be doctored away. Luke had buried her in the family plot on the rise behind the house, where she could look out over the valley she'd loved so much. The morning of that fateful January day, Luke had followed the same routine he'd maintained since Sarah's death. Up before dawn, dress by the light of a single lantern, check the animals, return to the house for coffee and whatever cold biscuits he'd managed to make the night before. He'd never been much of a cook. Sarah had handled that, along with the gardening, the preserving, the 100 small tasks that kept a homestead running smooth. In the months after the funeral, neighbors had brought casseroles and offers of help. Mrs. Garrett from the general store had even suggested, with the careful delicacy of a woman who knew her place, that perhaps Luke might consider the company of one of the several widows in the county. He'd thanked her politely and changed the subject, the way he'd learned to do whenever well-meaning folks tried to nudge him toward what they considered a proper future. But Luke's future felt fixed in amber, preserved in the moment Sarah had drawn her last breath. He'd kept her things exactly as she'd left them, her dresses still hanging in the wardrobe, her hairbrush still on the dresser, her sewing basket still beside her favorite chair. He told himself it was practical. He might need the extra blankets or the good china for company. Truth was, he couldn't bear to pack away the last physical evidence that she'd existed, that their 10 years together had been real. The isolation had hardened around him like ice on a stock pond. He still rode to town for supplies, still nodded to neighbors, still attended church on Sundays when the weather allowed. But he'd become a man who observed life rather than participated in it, watching from the edges while others married, had children, made plans that stretched beyond the current season. Doc Henderson, a thin man with kind eyes and a perpetual smell of carbolic soap, had tried to draw Luke back into the world of the living. "Grief's a season, Luke," he'd said more than once, usually while sharing a whiskey on Luke's front porch during his monthly visits. "But it ain't meant to be a permanent condition." Preacher Mills, a young man who'd arrived in Timber Butte just after Sarah's death, had been gentler but no less persistent. He'd quote scripture about seasons and renewal, about God's plan for joy after sorrow. Luke listened politely, but felt no stirring of hope. His faith hadn't died with Sarah, but it had certainly gone dormant, like seeds waiting for a spring that might never come. The only person who seemed to understand Luke's choice to remain frozen in place was Mrs. Garrett, though she'd lost her own husband to a mine collapse years before Luke had even arrived in the territory. She was a practical woman who ran the general store with the efficiency of a field marshal and the heart of a grandmother. When other folks clucked their tongues about Luke's solitary ways, she'd remind them that some folks needed longer to heal than others. That morning, as Luke prepared for his monthly ride to collect mail and supplies, he'd caught himself in the mirror again. The face looking back was recognizable, but somehow diminished, like a daguerreotype that had been left too long in the sun. He'd grown thinner, his clothes hanging loose on a frame that had once been solid with purpose. His eyes, once bright with plans and hopes, had settled into something that wasn't quite sadness, but wasn't contentment either. The ride to town would take him along the mail trail, a route he'd traveled countless times, but never without thinking of Sarah. She'd loved those trips, bundled beside him on the wagon seat, pointing out changes in the landscape, or sharing gossip she'd heard from the other ranch wives. The trail wound through a series of low hills and creek beds, past the old Brennan place that had stood empty since its owner had died the previous summer. Luke had saddled his horse, a reliable bay gelding named Buckshot, and loaded his saddlebags. With the list of supplies, he'd need to see him through the rest of the winter. The morning was bitter cold, the kind that made a man's breath freeze in his mustache and turned his fingers clumsy inside his gloves. But Luke had grown accustomed to the cold, both outside and in Dot as he'd ridden out. He'd passed the tobacco tin he kept on his kitchen shelf, the one that held Sarah's wedding ring. He'd taken it off her finger the day she died, unable to bear the thought of burying it with her, but equally unable to bear seeing it on his own hand. The tin had become a kind of shrine, a place where he could keep the physical reminder of their love without having to confront it every day. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was riding the mail trail on a day when the mail would bring someone else's abandoned bride into his life. If he'd been a man given to pondering the workings of fate, he might have seen the hand of Providence in the timing. But Luke McCrae had spent 3 years believing that Providence had forgotten about him entirely. The snow had started falling. Again as he'd crested the first hill, big flakes that clung to Buckshot's mane and gathered in the folds of Luke's coat. He'd pulled his hat lower and settled into the rhythm of the ride, letting his mind drift to the practical concerns of the day. How much grain to buy, whether the fence along the south pasture would hold through another storm, when he'd need to start thinking about spring planting. He'd been thinking about spring planting when Buckshot had shied at that dark shape in the snow, when Luke's carefully ordered world had encountered Rose Whitfield and cracked open like an egg. Buckshot's sudden sidestep nearly unseated Luke from the saddle. The gelding snorted and danced backward, his ears pinned forward at something that didn't belong in the pristine white landscape. Luke steadied his mount with a gentle hand and peered through the falling snow at what had spooked his normally unflappable horse dot at first glance. It looked like debris from the storm, maybe a fallen branch or a piece of canvas torn loose from some traveler's wagon. But as Luke dismounted and approached on foot, his boots crunching through the knee-deep drift, he could make out the shape of an overturned wagon, its wheels pointing skyward like the legs of a dead beetle. "Easy, boy," Luke murmured to Buckshot, though he wasn't sure if he was reassuring the horse or himself. The scene had an ominous quality that made the hair on the back of his neck prickle. Fresh snow had already begun to fill the wagon's tracks, but Luke could see where it had skidded off the trail and rolled, spilling its contents across the frozen ground. That's when he saw the dark bundle that had caught Buckshot's attention. Luke's heart kicked against his ribs as he realized he was looking at a person, a woman. Judging by the torn traveling cloak wrapped around a slender form, she lay motionless beside the wagon's wreckage, nearly buried under the snow that had been falling steadily since before dawn. He dropped to his knees beside her and brushed the snow from her face with hands that had suddenly gone unsteady. She was young, maybe 25, with dark hair that had escaped from its pins and lay tangled across her pale cheeks. Her lips were blue with cold, but when Luke pressed his ear close to her mouth, he could feel the faint whisper of breath against his cheek. "Thank God," he whispered, then began digging her free from the snow with his bare hands, his thick gloves too clumsy for the delicate work. Her body was frighteningly cold, but she stirred slightly when he lifted her, a soft moan escaping her. Lips. Luke's eyes swept the wreckage, looking for clues to what had happened. The wagon had clearly been traveling east to west along the mail trail when something, probably the storm's fierce winds, had caused it to overturn. Scattered around the site were the remnants of a traveler's belongings. A leather trunk split open to reveal women's clothing, a carpet bag, and what looked like official papers that the wind had plastered against a nearby snowbank. He gathered the papers with one hand while cradling the woman against his chest with the other. The documents were damp, but still legible, and what he read made his stomach clench with understanding. Marriage contract, railway ticket, a letter of introduction from one Rose Whitfield of Philadelphia to one Thomas Brennan of Dakota Territory, regarding their upcoming nuptials. A mail-order bride. The woman in his arms had traveled halfway across the country to marry a man she'd never met, only to find herself buried in a snowbank with her intended groom nowhere to be found. Luke's eyes swept the area again, this time with grim purpose. It didn't take long to spot the second mound of snow near the wagon's front end. He laid Rose gently against Buckshot's side and began digging, though he already knew what he'd find. Thomas Brennan had been thrown clear when the wagon overturned, but the heavy vehicle had rolled over him before settling upside down. He'd been dead for hours, probably since the worst of the storm had hit in the early morning darkness. Luke stood over the dead man for a moment, his hat in his hands, offering a silent prayer for a soul he'd never known, but whose death had just complicated his own life in ways he couldn't yet fathom. Thomas Brennan had been a few years younger than Luke, with the soft hands of a man who'd made his living with ledgers rather than livestock. He'd owned the homestead that bordered Luke's property to the south, though they'd rarely spoken beyond. Neighborly greetings at church or in town. Rose stirred again, this time opening her eyes briefly. They were gray, like storm clouds, and filled with confusion and fear. "Where?" she began, her voice barely audible. "You're safe," Luke said, though he wasn't sure how true that was. "There's been an accident. Can you tell me your name?" "Rose," she whispered. "Rose Whitfield. Thomas was supposed to." Her eyes closed again, and Luke felt panic rise in his throat. He gathered her into his arms and lifted her onto Buckshot's back, settling her in front of the saddle where he could hold her steady during the ride to town. The papers he stuffed into his saddlebags, along with what few personal items he could salvage from the wreckage. Thomas Brennan's body would have to wait for better weather and more help. The ride to Timber Butte took an hour through the deepening snow, with Luke fighting to keep Rose conscious by talking to her constantly. He told her about the town, about the people she'd meet, about anything he could think of to keep her mind focused on staying alive. She drifted in and out of awareness, sometimes responding with a word or two, sometimes slumping against him, so completely that he feared she'd slipped away by the time they reached the town's main street. Word had somehow already spread that Luke McCrae was riding in with a half-frozen woman in his arms. Doc Henderson was waiting on the steps of his office, and Preacher Mills stood beside him, both men's faces grave with concern. "Get her inside," Doc Henderson commanded, holding the door wide. "How long was she in the cold?" "Don't know for certain," Luke replied, carrying Rose into the doctor's warm office. "Found her buried beside an overturned wagon. Her intended husband is dead." Doc Henderson's examination was swift and professional. He warmed Rose with blankets and forced small sips of hot broth between her lips, checking her fingers and toes for frostbite, listening to her heart and lungs with the careful attention of a man who'd seen too many people lost to Dakota winters. "She'll live," he pronounced finally, but it was close. Another hour in that cold, and we'd be planning a funeral instead of a recovery. Preacher Mills, who'd been standing quietly in the corner, stepped forward. "Luke, we need to discuss her situation. A young woman traveling alone, unmarried, and now her intended husband is dead. The law won't look kindly on her circumstances, especially if anyone suggests impropriety." Luke felt his jaw tighten. He'd been so focused on saving Rose's life that he hadn't considered the social implications of her predicament. An unmarried woman alone on the frontier was vulnerable in ways that went far beyond the weather. "What are you suggesting, Preacher?" Mills glanced at Doc Henderson, who nodded slightly. "Marriage, Luke. Tonight, before word spreads any further. It's the only way to protect her reputation and give her legal standing in the territory." The words hit Luke like a physical blow. Marriage. To a stranger. To a woman who'd been meant for another man's bed and another man's name. Rose's eyes fluttered open at that moment, focusing on Luke's face with a clarity that hadn't been there before. "The papers," she whispered. "Did you find the marriage contract?" Luke nodded, pulling the documents from his saddlebag. Rose's fingers shook as she took them, her eyes scanning the legal language that had been meant to bind her to Thomas Brennan. "He's dead, isn't he?" she asked quietly. "Yes, ma'am." "I'm sorry." Rose closed her eyes, and Luke saw a single tear slip down her cheek. But when she opened them again, there was steel in her gray gaze that reminded him of Sarah in her most determined moments. "Then I'm ruined," she said simply. "A woman who travels unmarried to meet a man who spends time alone with strangers. No one will believe nothing improper happened." Preacher Mills leaned forward. "Not if you're married before sunset, Miss Whitfield. The law recognizes necessity, and these are extraordinary circumstances." Rose's eyes found Luke's. "You don't know me, Mr. McCrae. I could be anyone. A criminal, a fraud, a woman of ill repute." Luke studied her face, taking in the intelligence in her eyes, the quiet dignity with which she faced her impossible situation. "Could be," he agreed, "but I don't think you are." "And you?" Rose asked, What manner of man offers marriage to a stranger? The kind who doesn't want to watch an innocent woman suffer for circumstances beyond her control. Luke replied. A silence stretched between them, broken only by the pop of logs in Doc Henderson's stove and the whistle of wind outside the windows. Finally, Rose nodded. Then I accept your offer, Mr. McCrae, and may God forgive us both for what we're about to do. The wedding ceremony took place an hour before sunset in the small clapboard church that served Timber Boots faithful. Rose had insisted on being helped to her feet for the vows, though Doc Henderson had wanted her to remain in bed for at least another day. She stood beside Luke in her wrinkled traveling dress, her dark hair hastily pinned back, clutching a small cameo brooch that had somehow survived the wagon accident. The brooch had belonged to her mother. Rose had whispered to Luke, as they waited for Preacher Mills to gather his Bible and official papers. It was the only thing of value she had left, the only connection to the life she'd left behind in Philadelphia. She'd pinned it to her collar with trembling fingers, a tiny piece of elegance in circumstances that were anything but elegant. Luke wore his best Sunday suit, hastily retrieved from his ranch house by young Tommy Garrett, Mrs. Garrett's nephew, who'd volunteered to ride out and fetch whatever Luke might need. The boy had returned with the suit, a clean shirt, and Luke's father's pocket watch items that seemed to belong to a different man than the one who now stood before God and witnesses, promising to honor and protect a woman whose last name he'd learned only hours before. Preacher Mills kept the ceremony brief, understanding that Rose was still weak from her ordeal. The vows were traditional, but they felt strange in Luke's mouth. Words he'd spoken before to a different woman in a different lifetime. When Mills pronounced them husband and wife, Luke hesitated for a moment before placing a gentle kiss on Rose's forehead, a gesture that felt more like a blessing than a claim. The few witnesses Doc Henderson, Mrs. Garrett, and Tommy offered their congratulations with the careful politeness of people who understood they were watching something born of necessity rather than love. Mrs. Garrett had even brought a small bouquet of dried flowers from her store, pressing them into Rose's hands with a warm smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Every bride deserves flowers, she'd said simply. The ride back to Luke's ranch was conducted mostly in silence. Rose sat beside him on the wagon seat, wrapped in every blanket Doc Henderson could spare, her face pale but determined. She studied the landscape as they traveled, taking in the rolling hills and scattered homesteads that would now be her world. "It's beautiful," she said finally, as they crested the hill that gave the first view of Luke's valley. "Different from what I expected, but beautiful." Luke followed her gaze, trying to see his land through the eyes of a woman who'd spent her life in the crowded streets of Philadelphia. The house looked small and isolated in the gathering dusk, smoke rising from its chimney like a signal flag. "In the wilderness, it's quiet," he warned. "Sometimes folks who aren't used to the silence find it unsettling." Rose was quiet for a moment, then surprised him with a soft laugh. "Mr. McCrae, I've spent the last 6 months living in a boarding house with 12 other women, all hoping to find husbands out west. Believe me, I won't mind the quiet." Inside the house, Luke moved with the awkward efficiency of a man trying to be hospitable to a guest he'd never expected. He stirred up the fire in the main room, put coffee on to boil, and tried to figure out where Rose should sleep. The house had 2 bedrooms, the one he'd shared with Sarah, and a smaller room that had been meant for children who'd never come. "I'll take the spare room," Rose said, as if reading his thoughts. "If that's agreeable to you." Luke nodded, relieved. "I'll get some linens. The room's been closed up for a while, but it's got a good stove." As he gathered blankets and sheets from the cedar chest in his bedroom, Luke caught sight of himself in Sarah's mirror. He looked like a man who'd lived through several lifetimes in a single day, exhausted, confused, and somehow different than he'd been that morning. The face looking back at him belonged to a married man again, though he felt anything but married. When he returned to the main room, he found Rose standing by the fireplace, studying the daguerreotype of Sarah that sat on the mantel. She didn't touch it, didn't even lean closer for a better look, but her presence near it made Luke's chest tighten. She was beautiful, Rose said without turning around. Yes, Luke replied simply. How long were you married? 10 years. Rose nodded. Still looking at the photograph, I can see why you loved her. She has kind eyes. Luke set the linens on a chair and joined Rose by the fireplace, following her gaze to Sarah's familiar face. Strange how the photograph looked different somehow, as if Sarah's image had changed simply because another woman was looking at it. She died 3 years ago, Luke said. Fever. I'm sorry. Rose turned to face him then, and Luke was struck by the genuine sympathy in her gray eyes. This must be difficult for you, being married again. Luke considered his answer carefully. I won't lie to you, Mrs. McCrae. This wasn't something I ever planned to do. But circumstances being what they are, Mrs. McCrae, Rose repeated softly, as if testing how the name sounded. I suppose that's who I am now. They looked at each other across the space between them, two people bound by law and necessity, but strangers in every way that mattered. Luke found himself noticing details he'd missed during the crisis of the day, the way Rose's dark hair caught the firelight, the intelligence in her eyes, the quiet dignity with which she faced an impossible situation. We should establish some understandings, Rose said finally, about how we'll manage this arrangement. Luke appreciated her practical approach. I'm listening. I don't expect you to be a husband to me in the traditional sense, Rose began, her cheeks coloring slightly. This is a marriage of convenience, born of necessity. I'll do my part to keep the house and help with whatever needs doing, but I won't presume to take the place of your wife. The careful way she said, your wife, as distinct from what she now was legally, told Luke she understood the complexity of their situation better than he'd given her credit for. And I won't expect you to be anything other than what you choose to be, Luke replied. You're safe here, Mrs. McCrae. Whatever else happens, you have my word on that. Rose smiled then, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her, and Luke felt something shift in his chest, not love, nothing so dramatic, but perhaps the first crack in the ice that had formed around his heart 3 winters ago. Thank you, she said, for everything. I know this can't be easy for you. Luke helped her settle into the spare room, lighting the small stove and showing her where he'd put extra quilts. The room felt strange with another person in it. He'd used it mostly for storage since Sarah's death, and seeing Rose's few belongings arranged on the dresser made the house feel different somehow. As he bid her good night and closed the door. Between them, Luke stood for a moment in the hallway, listening to the sounds of another person moving around his house. For 3 years, he'd grown accustomed to the silence, to the echo of his own footsteps on the wooden floors. Now there were other sounds, the rustle of fabric, the creak of a bed that hadn't been slept in for years, the soft murmur of a woman's voice as Rose whispered what sounded like a prayer. Luke returned to his own room and sat on the edge of his bed, his father's pocket watch heavy in his hands. The watch had been a wedding gift from Sarah, engraved with their initials and their wedding date. He'd carried it every day since, a reminder of promises made and kept until death parted them. Now he was married again, to a woman who understood that she wasn't replacing Sarah, but simply sharing space in a life that had been frozen in time. It should have felt wrong, this practical arrangement, born of crisis and necessity. Instead, as Luke listened to the quiet sounds of Rose settling into her new life, he felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years, the possibility that tomorrow might be different from today. Luke woke before dawn, as was his habit, but lay in bed for several minutes, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of another person moving around his house. Rose was already up, her footsteps soft but distinct in the kitchen below. The smell of coffee drifted up through the floorboards, stronger and more fragrant than the bitter brew he typically made for himself. When he came downstairs, he found Rose standing at the stove, wrapped in Sarah's old robe that she must have found in the spare room's wardrobe. Her dark hair was braided down her back, and she moved with the careful efficiency of someone trying not to make noise in an unfamiliar space. "Good morning," she said, turning with a cup of coffee in her hands. "I hope you don't mind that I made myself at home in your kitchen." Luke accepted the coffee gratefully, noting that it was perfectly prepared, not too strong, not too weak, with just enough heat to warm his hands through the ceramic mug. "Thank you." "You didn't need to." "Yes, I did," Rose interrupted gently. "If I'm to live here, I need to earn my place. I won't be a burden to you, Mr. McCrae." Luke studied her face in the early morning light filtering through the kitchen window. She looked better than she had the night before. Color had returned to her cheeks, and her gray eyes were clear and alert. But there was something fragile about her still, a carefully maintained composure that reminded him of thin ice over deep water. "Luke," he said, "if we're to be what we are, you should call me Luke." Rose nodded. "Luke, and you should call me Rose." They shared a simple breakfast of eggs and biscuits, the kind of meal Luke had been preparing for himself for 3 years, but which somehow tasted better when shared. Rose ate carefully, still recovering from her ordeal, but she asked questions. About the ranch, about the animals, about the routines that governed Luke's days. "I've never lived on a working ranch," she admitted. "In Philadelphia, I worked as a seamstress, and before that, I helped my mother with her millinery shop. I'm not sure how useful I'll be with cattle and horses." "You'll learn," Luke said. "And there's plenty of indoor work that needs doing." Sarah always said running a homestead was as much about what happened in the house as what happened in the fields. At the mention of Sarah's name, Rose grew quiet, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. Luke realized he'd spoken of his first wife naturally, without the sharp pang of grief that usually accompanied her memory. "Tell me about her," Rose said softly. "If you don't mind. I'd like to understand who she was." Luke considered the request, surprised to find that he wanted to talk about Sarah, to share her memory with someone who would understand the weight of it. "She was practical," he began. "Came west with her family when she was 16, and she understood from the start what frontier life demanded. But she was also joyful. She could find something to celebrate in the smallest things, a successful batch of bread, the first wildflowers in spring, letters from her sister back in Ohio." Rose listened without interruption, her attention complete and respectful. "She wanted children," Luke continued. "We tried for years, but it never happened. The doctor said it wasn't anyone's fault, just one of those things. But Sarah never let it make her bitter. She mothered every child in the county instead, and they all loved her for it." "She sounds like a remarkable woman," Rose said. She was. Luke paused, then added, "I don't want you to think you need to be like her. Rose, this situation is different from what Sarah and I had. I wouldn't expect you to fill the same role." Rose smiled, but there was sadness in it. "I appreciate that, Luke. But I think you should know, I'm not entirely sure what role I can fill. I've never been a wife before, even in name only. I'm not sure I know how to be one." After breakfast, Luke showed Rose around the ranch, pointing out the various buildings and explaining the routines that kept the operation running. She walked beside him through the snow, wrapped in one of Sarah's heavy coats that was too big for her slender frame, but provided the warmth she needed. In the barn, Rose met the animals with the careful curiosity of someone who'd lived her entire life in the city. The milk cow, Bessie, seemed to sense her nervousness and lowed gently, as if offering reassurance. The chickens, however, were less welcoming, squawking and fluttering when Rose approached their coop. "They're protective of their territory," Luke explained, scattering feed while Rose watched from a safe distance. "Like most females, they don't trust strangers right away." Rose laughed, the first time Luke had heard the sound from her. It was warm and genuine, transforming her face from merely pretty to genuinely beautiful. That afternoon, while Luke tended to repairs in the barn, Rose explored the house more thoroughly. She found Sarah's cookbook in the kitchen, its pages filled with handwritten notes and modifications. The recipes were practical and suited to frontier life. How to make bread with limited ingredients, how to preserve meat without a proper ice house, how to stretch a small amount of sugar through an entire winter. When Luke returned for supper, he found Rose sitting at the kitchen table with the cookbook open before her, studying a page about making soap from kitchen scraps. "I hope you don't mind," she said, looking up at him with a slight flush in her cheeks. "I was trying to understand how to manage a household out here. It's quite different from city living." Luke sat down across from her, noting how natural it felt to have someone waiting for him at the end of the day, someone interested in the practical details of the life they would share. "Sarah was a good teacher," he said, glancing at the cookbook. "She learned most of those recipes from her mother, and then improved on them through trial and error." Rose turned a few pages, pausing at a recipe for apple butter that was covered in Sarah's careful handwriting. She must have been very organized. These notes are so detailed. She believed in doing things right, Luke agreed. Said there was no point in wasting time and ingredients on something that wouldn't turn out proper. As they prepared supper together, Rose following one of Sarah's simpler recipes while Luke handled the heavier tasks, Luke found himself comparing the two women not with the intention of judging one against the other, but with genuine curiosity about their differences. Where Sarah had been confident and instinctive in the kitchen, Rose was methodical and careful, checking and double-checking each step. Where Sarah had hummed while she worked, Rose was quietly focused, her attention completely absorbed by the unfamiliar tasks. But both women, Luke realized, shared an essential quality. They approached challenges with determination rather than complaint, finding ways to adapt rather than reasons to give up. "Luke," Rose said as they sat down to eat the meal they'd prepared together, "I want you to know that I understand what you've done for me. Not just the marriage, but the kindness. You saved my life, and then you gave me a future when I had none." Luke felt uncomfortable with her gratitude, not because it wasn't deserved, but because it made their arrangement feel more weighty than he was prepared to handle. "You don't owe me anything, Rose. We're both making the best of an unusual situation." "Perhaps," Rose said, "but I want you to know that I won't take your generosity for granted. I may not know how to be a frontier wife, but I'm willing to learn, and I promise I'll do my best to be a help to you rather than a hindrance." Looking at her across the table, her face earnest in the lamplight, Luke felt something he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death, the sense that he wasn't completely alone in the world. It wasn't love. He wasn't ready for that. Might never be ready for that again. But it was companionship, the comfort of shared purpose and mutual respect. "I think we'll manage just fine," he said, and meant it. 2 weeks into their arrangement, Luke and Rose had settled into a rhythm that felt almost natural. Rose had proven herself remarkably adaptable, mastering the intricacies of the wood-burning stove, learning to manage the temperamental chickens, and even helping Luke with the endless task of keeping the animals fed and watered during the harsh January weather. She had also proven herself to be surprisingly good company. Rose possessed a quiet intelligence that Luke found refreshing after years of solitude. She asked thoughtful questions about ranch management, listened carefully to his explanations, and offered observations that showed she was truly trying to understand her new world. On this particular morning, Luke was replacing a broken hinge on the barn door when he heard Rose's voice from inside the house, raised in what sounded like distress. He dropped his tools and hurried inside, finding her standing in his bedroom doorway, a piece of paper clutched in her trembling hands. "Rose, what's wrong?" She turned to him, her face pale, and held out the paper. "I was dusting, and I knocked over the small box on your dresser. This fell out." Luke's heart sank as he recognized his military discharge papers from the Union Army. He'd kept them in the wooden box that had been his father's, along with a few other documents he rarely looked at but couldn't bring himself to throw away. "You were a soldier," Rose said, and it wasn't a question. Luke took the papers from her hands, his fingers tracing the familiar script that declared his honorable discharge from the 2nd Dakota Cavalry Regiment in 1865. He'd been young then, barely 21, full of fire and righteous anger about preserving the Union. The war had changed him in ways that still echoed through his life 20 years later. "I was," he admitted, "for 3 years during the war." Rose studied his face with the same careful attention she'd given to Sarah's cookbook. "You never mentioned it. It's not something I talk about much." Luke folded the papers and placed them back in the box, but he didn't close the lid immediately. "Most folks around here know, but it doesn't feel like something that defines who I am now." "What did you do? In the war, I mean." Luke sat down heavily on the edge of his bed, surprised by Rose's direct question. Most people, especially women, preferred to let a man's military service remain wrapped in polite silence. "I was cavalry," he said finally. "Started as a private, ended as a sergeant. We fought mostly in Missouri and Arkansas, trying to keep Confederate forces from disrupting supply lines." Rose sat down in the chair by the window, her attention completely focused on him. "Was it difficult?" Luke almost smiled at the careful way she phrased the question. "War's always difficult, Rose, but yes, it was hard. Harder than I expected when I enlisted." He found himself telling her things he'd never shared with Sarah. Details about the camaraderie among the soldiers, the strange mixture of boredom and terror that defined military life, the way a man could change from who he'd been before he put on a uniform. "I learned things about myself that I wasn't sure I wanted to know," Luke admitted. "About what I was capable of when pushed. About how quickly a civilized man can become something else entirely." Rose was quiet for a long moment, absorbing his words. "Is that why you came west? To get away from who you'd been during the war?" The question was perceptive in a way that caught Luke off guard. "Partly. Sarah and I met just after I was discharged. She was visiting her aunt in Kansas, and I was trying to figure out what came next. When she said she wanted to homestead in Dakota Territory, it seemed like a good place to start over." "And it was? A good place to start over?" Luke looked around the bedroom he'd shared with Sarah, at the simple furniture they'd bought together, the few personal items that had survived. Their journey west. "For a while, yes. Sarah helped me remember who I'd been before the war. She made it possible for me to be that person again." Rose stood and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape. "What about now? Do you feel like you're starting over again?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that Luke wasn't sure he was ready to explore. But Rose's presence in his life had certainly changed things, had awakened parts of himself that had been dormant since Sarah's death. "I don't know," he said honestly. "These past 2 weeks, they've been different. Not bad different, just different." Rose turned from the window, and Luke was struck by the thoughtful expression on her face. "You've been kind to me, Luke. Patient. But I sometimes wonder if you're being kind to yourself." "What do you mean?" "You've kept everything exactly as it was when Sarah died. Her clothes, her personal items, even her side of the bed. It's like you've been living in a shrine rather than a home." Luke felt a flash of defensiveness, then realized Rose wasn't criticizing him, but rather expressing concern. "Those things are all I have left of her." "No," Rose said gently. "You have your memories of her, your love for her, the way she changed you for the better. Those things are part of who you are now, and they always will be. But keeping her hairbrush on the dresser doesn't bring her back, Luke. It just keeps you from moving forward." The conversation felt dangerous, like walking on ice that might crack at any moment. But Luke found himself drawn to Rose's perspective, even as it challenged everything he'd believed about honoring Sarah's memory. "What are you suggesting?" Rose returned to her chair, choosing her words carefully. "I'm not suggesting you forget her or pretend she never existed. But perhaps you could find a way to honor her memory that doesn't require you to live in the past." That afternoon, while Rose worked on mending some of Luke's shirts, he found himself in the barn, thinking about their conversation. The truth was, he had been living in the past, treating his grief like a sacred duty that required constant tending. But Rose's presence had shown him something he hadn't realized. Sarah wouldn't have wanted him to stop living. When he returned to the house for supper, he found Rose in the kitchen, following one of Sarah's recipes, but making small modifications based on the ingredients they had available. She'd braided her hair differently, too, in a style that was distinctly her own, rather than an attempt to copy the way Sarah had worn hers. "Smells good," Luke said, hanging his coat by the door. "I hope it tastes as good as it smells," Rose replied. "I took some liberties with the recipe. Added some herbs I found dried in the pantry." Luke recognized the herbs as ones Sarah had grown in her garden, carefully preserved for winter use. But instead of feeling like Rose was overstepping, he found himself curious about how the familiar dish might taste with her modifications. Over supper, Rose told him about her life in Philadelphia, about the boarding house where she'd lived while saving money for her journey west, about the other women who'd been seeking husbands through matrimonial advertisements. "Were you friends with any of them?" Luke asked. Rose considered the question. "Some of them. There was a woman named Margaret who was probably the closest thing to a friend I had there. She was older, maybe 35, and she'd been corresponding with a widower in Oregon who had 3 children. Did she find what she was looking for? I hope so. She left 2 weeks before I did, full of optimism about becoming a mother to those children." Rose paused, then added, "It's strange to think that we were all taking such enormous leaps of faith, trusting our futures to men we'd never met." Luke thought about the leap of faith Rose had taken in accepting his proposal, how she'd trusted her safety and future to a stranger who'd found her buried in snow. "Do you regret it?" he asked. "Coming west, I mean, given how things turned out." Rose was quiet for a moment, considering his question with the same careful thought she brought to everything else. "I regret that Thomas Brennan died, and I regret the circumstances that led to our marriage. But do I regret being here in this house with you? No, Luke, I don't regret that." Her words settled something in Luke's chest, a knot of guilt he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. The idea that Rose might actually be content with their arrangement, that she might find some measure of happiness in this life they were building together, felt like a gift he hadn't expected. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Luke reading a month-old newspaper from town, while Rose worked on her mending, he found himself stealing glances at her. She'd grown more comfortable in the house, moving through the rooms with increasing confidence, making small changes that improved the functionality without erasing Sarah's presence. She'd rearranged the kitchen slightly, positioning the most used items within easier reach. She'd moved her sewing basket to the spot by the window where the afternoon light was best. Small changes, practical ones, that made the house feel more lived in rather than preserved. "Rose," Luke said, setting down his newspaper, "tomorrow I need to ride to the Hendricks place to check on their sick horse. Would you like to come with me? Meet some of the neighbors?" Rose looked up from her sewing, needle poised in mid-stitch. "Would that be appropriate?" "For people to see us together so soon after we're married," Luke said simply. "It's perfectly appropriate for a man to travel with his wife." The word wife still felt strange in his mouth, but less strange than it had 2 weeks ago. Rose seemed to feel the same strangeness, judging by the slight flush that colored her cheeks. "I'd like that," she said. "I should probably meet the people I'll be living among." As Luke banked the fire for the night and Rose gathered her sewing materials. He realized that for the first time since Sarah's death, he was looking forward to tomorrow, not just to the routine tasks that filled his days, but to sharing those tasks with someone else, to seeing his world through Rose's eyes. It was a small thing, this anticipation, but it felt like the first green shoot pushing through winter soil. Sign that something new might be growing in the frozen ground of his heart. 1 month into their marriage, Luke found Rose in the spare bedroom that had become hers, sitting at the small writing desk he'd brought in from the barn and positioned by the window. She was bent over a piece of paper, her pen moving slowly across the page, pausing frequently as if searching for the right words. "Writing to your family?" Luke asked from the doorway. Rose looked up, startled, then set down her pen with a sigh. "Trying to... My sister Catherine expects a letter, but I'm not sure how to explain all of this." Luke stepped into the room, noting the crumpled papers in the wastebasket that suggested Rose had made several attempts at this letter. "What did you tell her before? About coming west?" "The truth, mostly. That I was coming to marry Thomas Brennan. That I hoped to build a good life in Dakota Territory." Rose gestured at the unfinished letter. "But how do I explain that Thomas died, that I married a stranger instead, that I'm living as a wife, but not really a wife?" Luke sat down on the edge of Rose's bed, struck by the complexity of their situation from her perspective. He'd been focused on the practical aspects of their arrangement, but Rose was dealing with the emotional and social implications of explaining their marriage to people who would never understand the circumstances. "What do you want to tell her?" he asked. Rose picked up the pen again, turning it between her fingers. "I want to tell her that I'm safe, that I'm cared for, that I'm learning to be useful in a way I never was in Philadelphia. But I also want to be honest about what our marriage is and isn't." "And what is it, Rose? Our marriage?" The question surprised them both. Luke hadn't meant to ask it so directly, but Rose's struggle with her letter had brought the ambiguity of their relationship into sharp focus. Rose was quiet for a long moment, looking out the window at the landscape that was beginning to show the first subtle signs of approaching spring. "I don't know," she said finally. "It's more than a legal arrangement. We've become friends, haven't we? But it's not what Catherine would recognize as a marriage. We share a house, meals, daily routines, but not intimacy." Luke felt heat rise in his face at her frank acknowledgement of what was missing from their relationship. But Rose's honesty deserved an equally honest response. "Would you want that to change?" he asked quietly. Rose's fingers stilled on the pen, and Luke saw her swallow hard before answering. "I don't know that either," she said. I've never been with a man in that way. And you're still grieving Sarah, still wearing your wedding ring from her." Luke looked down at his left hand, at the simple gold band he'd worn for 13 years. He'd put it on the day he married Sarah, and had never taken it off, not even during the hardest physical labor. It had become as much a part of him as his own skin. "I hadn't thought about it," he admitted. "The ring, I mean. It's always been there. It tells people, and maybe tells you, that you're still married to her," Rose said gently. "Which, in your heart, perhaps you are." That afternoon, while Rose worked on her letter, Luke found himself standing at Sarah's grave for the first time since the day he'd buried her. The simple wooden cross he'd made was weathered now. The words he'd carved nearly faded by 3 winters of Dakota storms. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do, Sarah," he said aloud, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. "I never expected to be in this situation. Never wanted to be married to anyone but you." The wind moved through the bare branches of the cottonwood tree he'd planted beside her grave, making a sound like whispered conversation. Luke had never been a man given to signs and portents, but something about the moment felt significant. "She's a good woman," he continued. "Rose, she's kind and sensible, and she doesn't try to be you. But I don't know how to move forward without feeling like I'm betraying what we had. When he returned to the house, Luke found Rose in the kitchen, her letter apparently finished and sealed in an envelope. She was preparing supper, moving around the space with the confidence she'd developed over the past month. "How did the letter turn out?" Luke asked. Rose smiled, but there was something wistful in it. "I told Catherine that I married a good man who treats me with respect and kindness. I told her that I'm learning to manage a household and that I'm safe. I didn't tell her that my husband is still in love with his dead wife." The words hit Luke like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. He was still in love with Sarah, still defined by that love in ways that left little room for anyone else. "Rose, It's all right, Luke." Rose interrupted. "I'm not criticizing you. I'm just acknowledging what is. You've been more generous to me than you had any obligation to be. I won't ask for more than you can give." That evening, as they sat by the fire, Luke found himself studying Rose with new attention. Over the past month, she'd grown less pale, her city pallor replaced by the subtle color that came from frontier life. Her hands, once soft from her work as a seamstress, now showed the calluses that came from handling chickens and hauling water. She'd changed in other ways, too. The careful, frightened woman he'd pulled from the snow had been replaced by someone more confident, more settled in her own skin. She belonged here now, in this house, in this life, in ways that had nothing to do with legal documents or social convenience. "Rose," Luke said, interrupting her reading, "I want you to know that you're not just someone I'm helping. You've become important to me. I look forward to talking with you, to sharing meals with you. You've made this house feel like a home again." Rose set down her book, giving him her full attention. "Thank you for saying that. It means more than you know. But you're right about the other thing, too. About Sarah. I don't know how to let go of that love without feeling like I'm diminishing what she meant to me." Rose considered his words, then said something that surprised him. "Maybe you don't have to let go of it, Luke. Maybe you just have to make room for something else alongside it." The idea was revolutionary to Luke, who'd spent 3 years treating his love for Sarah like a finite resource that couldn't be shared or divided. But Rose's suggestion offered a different possibility, that the heart might be more expansive than he'd imagined. "I don't know how to do that," he admitted. "Neither do I," Rose said. "But perhaps we could figure it out together." Later that night, Luke lay in his bed listening to Rose moving around in her room, the small sounds of her evening routine that had become familiar and comforting. He thought about what she'd said, about making room for something new alongside. His love for Sarah. For the first time since Sarah's death, Luke took off his wedding ring. It felt strange to see his finger without it, pale and slightly indented where the band had rested for so many years. He held the ring up to the lamplight, studying the simple gold circle that had bound him to Sarah and, in a different way, had bound him to the past. He placed the ring carefully in the tobacco tin where he kept Sarah's ring, not discarding it, but putting it away as a treasured memory rather than a daily reminder of what he'd lost. It felt like a first step toward something he couldn't yet name, but which felt, for the first time in 3 years, like moving forward rather than standing still. The mail arrived on a Tuesday in early March, carried by young Tommy Garrett, who'd ridden out from town with a leather satchel full of letters and packages. Luke was mending fence in the south pasture when he saw the boy approaching, and he walked back to the house to collect whatever correspondence had arrived. Rose met them at the front door, accepting a thick envelope that Tommy said had come on the train from Deadwood, along with the regular mail delivery. The envelope was official-looking, bearing the seal of a law office and addressed to Rose Whitfield or her legal representative. "What do you suppose it is?" Rose asked, turning the envelope over in her hands. Luke studied the return address, Blackwood. "And Associates, Attorneys at Law, Deadwood, Dakota Territory." Only one way to find out. Rose opened the envelope carefully, unfolding several sheets of legal-looking documents. As she read, Luke watched her face change from curiosity to surprise to something approaching shock. "Rose? What is it?" She looked up at him, her gray eyes wide with disbelief. "It's about Thomas Brennan's estate. His property, his livestock. Luke, he left everything to me." Luke felt the ground shift beneath his feet. "What do you mean, everything?" Rose handed him the documents, her hands trembling slightly. "According to this, Thomas updated his will just before I arrived. He left his entire estate to Rose Whitfield, my intended bride, in the event of my death before our marriage could be solemnized. The lawyers in Deadwood have been trying to locate me since the spring thaw made travel possible." Luke scanned the legal documents, his mind racing to understand the implications. Thomas Brennan's homestead was substantial 320 acres of good, grazing land that bordered Luke's property to the south. A modest house, a well-built barn, and a herd of cattle that had somehow survived the winter under the care of neighboring ranchers. "This makes you a woman of property, Rose," Luke said slowly. "Independent. Wealthy by frontier standards." Rose took the papers back, staring at them as if they might change if she looked hard enough. "I don't understand. Why would he leave everything to a woman he'd never met?" Luke remembered Thomas Brennan as a quiet man, a few years younger than himself, who'd come to Dakota Territory with a modest inheritance and clear plans for building a ranch. He'd been methodical, careful, the kind of man who would indeed update his will before taking on the responsibility of a wife. He was planning to marry you, Rose. In his mind, you were already family, already entitled to share in what he built. The weight of this revelation settled over both of them like a heavy blanket. Rose was no longer a woman dependent on Luke's charity, no longer bound by necessity to their arrangement. She had options now, choices that included independence and autonomy. "What does this mean for us?" Rose asked quietly. Luke felt his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite name: fear, perhaps, or loss, or the sudden realization that Rose might choose to leave him now that she could. "It means you don't need me anymore," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "You can claim your inheritance, establish yourself on your own land, live however you choose." Rose was quiet for a long moment, her attention focused on the legal documents. When she finally looked up, Luke was surprised to see something like pain in her eyes. "Is that what you want, Luke? For me to leave?" The question caught him off guard. What did he want? For weeks, he'd been telling himself that their marriage was temporary, a practical arrangement that would end when circumstances changed. But now, faced with the possibility of Rose's departure, he realized how much he'd come to depend on her presence, her conversation, her quiet companionship. "What I want doesn't matter," Luke said. "What matters is that you now have the freedom to choose your own future." Rose folded the documents carefully, her movements precise and controlled. "You didn't answer my question, Luke." Luke looked at her, really looked at her, taking in the woman she'd become during their months together. She was no longer the half-frozen stranger he'd pulled from the snow. She was stronger now, more confident, more settled in her own skin. She belonged here, in this landscape, in this life they built together. But she also deserved better than a husband who could only offer her friendship and practical partnership. "You deserve more than what I can give you, Rose," Luke said finally. "You deserve a man who can love you the way you should be loved, not someone still bound to the past." Rose's expression hardened, and Luke saw a flash of something that might have been anger. "Don't you think that should be my choice to make?" Before Luke could respond, Rose had gathered the legal documents and walked to her room, closing the door behind her with more force than necessary. Luke stood in the empty kitchen, feeling like he just made a terrible mistake, but unsure what he should have done differently. That evening, Rose emerged from her room with a traveling bag in her hands and a determined expression on her face. Luke's heart lurched at the sight of the bag, thinking she'd decided to leave immediately. "I'm going to town," Rose announced, "to speak with a lawyer's representative and to see Thomas's property. I need to understand exactly what I've inherited." "I'll take you," Luke said quickly. "No." Rose's voice was firm. "I need to do this myself, Luke. I need to see what my options are without your guidance." Luke recognized the stubbornness in her tone, the same quality that had helped her survive her journey west and adapt to frontier life. "Rose, it's not safe for a woman to travel alone. I'm not helpless, Luke, and I won't be treated like a child who can't make her own decisions." Luke watched her load her bag onto the wagon, her movements sharp with suppressed emotion. Part of him wanted to argue, to insist on accompanying her, to maintain some measure of control over a situation that was rapidly spinning beyond his influence. But another part of him, the part that had grown to respect Rose's intelligence and strength, recognized that she needed this independence, this chance to make her own choices without his well-meaning interference. "How long will you be gone?" he asked. "I don't know," Rose replied, not meeting his eyes. "As long as it takes to figure out what I want to do with my life." She drove away without looking back, leaving Luke standing in the doorway of a house that suddenly felt hollow and empty. For the first time since Sarah's death, he was truly alone, not just physically, but emotionally cut off from the possibility of connection he hadn't realized he'd grown to need. That night, Luke sat by the fire with a tobacco tin in his hands, looking at the 2 wedding rings that contained Sarah's thin gold band and his own, recently removed. He thought about the choice Rose was facing, the freedom she'd suddenly gained, and the terrible possibility that she might decide she was better off without him. The house creaked around him in the wind, full of echoes and memories, and the absence of the woman who'd brought it back to life. Luke realized, with the clarity that comes from potential loss, that somewhere in the past months he'd stopped thinking of Rose as a temporary convenience and started thinking of her as home. But he also realized that wanting her to stay and believing he deserved her to stay were 2 very different things. Rose had a choice now, real options and real independence. If she chose to leave, Luke would have to accept that decision and find a way to be grateful for the months of companionship she'd be given him, even if the thought of losing her felt like dying all over again. Rose had been gone for 4 days when Doc Henderson rode out to the ranch, his face grave with the kind of news that couldn't wait for Luke's next trip to town. "She's staying at the boarding house," Doc reported, accepting the cup of coffee Luke offered, but declining to sit down. "Been meeting with the lawyers, riding out to look at the Brennan place with that surveyor from Deadwood." Luke felt his stomach clench. "How does she seem?" Doc studied Luke's face with the careful attention of a man who'd spent years reading the subtle signs of human distress. Determined, thoughtful, like a woman trying to make the most important decision of her life. Luke set down his own coffee, suddenly unable to stomach the bitter taste. Has she said anything about what she's planning to do?" "Not to me directly. But Mrs. Garrett mentioned Rose, asked about supplies for setting up a household, about hiring help for spring planting." Doc paused, then added gently, "Luke, she's got every right to claim that inheritance and build her own life." "I know that. Do you?" "Because from where I'm sitting, you look like a man who's already grieving another loss." Luke turned away from Doc's too perceptive gaze, focusing on the view from his kitchen window. The snow was melting in earnest now, revealing patches of brown earth and the first tentative green shoots of spring grass. In a few weeks, the landscape would be transformed from winter's stark beauty to the promise of new growth. "What would you have me do, Doc? Beg her to stay? Tell her she belongs here when she's got the means to make her own way." Doc finished his coffee and set the cup on the table with a deliberate clink. "I'd have you figure out what you really want, Luke, and then have the courage to fight for it." After Doc left, Luke found himself walking to the boundary between his property and what had been Thomas Brennan's land. The fence line was clearly marked, but Luke could see where the two properties might be joined. How the combined acreage would create one of the largest ranches in the territory. Was that what Rose was thinking? That she could merge their lands, create something bigger and more prosperous than either property could be alone. The idea had practical merit, but it also felt calculating in a way that didn't match the woman he'd come to know. The next morning brought Preacher Mills to Luke's door, his young face serious with the weight of pastoral concern. "I've come to ask you a question, Luke, and I hope you'll give me an honest answer." Luke poured coffee for both of them, noting that he was developing a habit of feeding his visitors instead of addressing their concerns directly. "I'm listening, Preacher. Do you love her?" The question hung in the air between them, stark and unavoidable. Luke felt his chest tighten with the complexity of what he felt for Rose's affection. Certainly, and respect, and something deeper that he'd been afraid to examine too closely. "It's not that simple," Luke said finally, "isn't it?" Mills leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "Luke, I've watched you these past months. You've come alive again in ways I never thought I'd see. When you talk about Rose, when you mention something she said or did, your whole face changes." Luke stood abruptly, pacing to the window. "I loved Sarah, Preacher. Loved her completely, with everything I had. What I feel for Rose, it's different. Different how?" Luke struggled to find words for something he'd never tried to articulate. With Sarah, it was passionate, all-consuming. We were young, and everything felt urgent and intense. What I feel for Rose is quieter, deeper maybe. Like she's become part of the fabric of my life in a way I didn't expect. Mills nodded slowly. "That sounds like love to me, Luke. Mature love. The kind that grows stronger over time, rather than burning itself out. But what if I'm wrong? What if what I'm feeling is just loneliness? Gratitude for her companionship? Then you'll have learned something important about yourself. But Luke, what if you're right? What if you've been given a second chance at happiness, and you're about to throw it away because you're afraid to trust your own heart?" That afternoon, Luke rode to town for the first time since Rose had left. He told himself he was going for supplies, but he knew he was really going to see her, to try to understand what she was thinking and feeling. He found her coming out of the general store, carrying packages that suggested she was indeed planning to set up her own household. She looked different somehow, more self-possessed, more confident, like a woman who'd remembered her own strength. "Luke," she said, her voice carefully neutral, "I didn't expect to see you in town." "Needed supplies," he said, then felt foolish. For the obvious lie. "How are you, Rose?" "I'm well, thank you." She shifted the packages in her arms, a gesture that seemed designed to keep distance between them. "I've been learning about my inheritance. It's quite substantial." Luke nodded, not trusting himself to speak without revealing too much of what he was feeling. "The lawyers say I can take possession immediately," Rose continued. "The house needs some work, but it's sound. The cattle have been well cared for by the neighbors." "That's good," Luke managed. "Thomas would be pleased to know his legacy is in good hands." Rose's expression softened slightly at the mention of Thomas Brennan. "I've been thinking about that, actually. About what he would have wanted, what kind of life we might have built together. And I think he would have wanted me to be happy, Luke, to build the kind of life that brings joy rather than just security." Before Luke could respond, Rose had stepped around him and continued down the street toward the boarding house. Luke watched her go, feeling like he'd missed some crucial opportunity, but unsure what he should have said. That evening, Luke sat on his front porch despite the lingering chill in the air, watching the sun set over the valley that had been his home for more than a decade. The house behind him felt empty in a way it hadn't since the first months after Sarah's death, but it was a different kind of emptiness, not the hollow ache of permanent loss. but the suspended feeling of waiting for something to be resolved. Mrs. Garrett appeared at his gate, carrying a covered dish and wearing the determined expression of a woman with something important to say. "Brought you some stew," she announced, settling herself in the chair beside him without invitation. "Figured. You weren't eating properly with Rose gone." Luke accepted the dish gratefully, though he wasn't particularly hungry. "Thank you, Mrs. Garrett. That's kind of you." "Kindness has nothing to do with it," she said briskly. "I've got something to say to you, Luke McCrae, and you're going to listen." Luke suppressed a smile at her commanding tone. Mrs. Garrett had been bossing the men of Timber Butte around for years, and most of them were wise enough to let her. "That girl is in love with you," Mrs. Garrett announced without preamble. "Has been for weeks, though she's too proud to say, so while you're still pining after a ghost." Luke felt his face flush. "Mrs. Garrett, I don't care what you think, Luke. I care about what you're going to do. Rose Whitfield is the best thing that's happened to you since Sarah died. And if you let her slip away, because you're too stubborn to admit you love her back, you're a bigger fool than I took you for." Luke stared at the older woman, struck by the fierce protectiveness in her voice. "How can you be so sure she loves me?" Mrs. Garrett snorted. "Because I have eyes, boy, and because she asked me yesterday what I thought you'd do if she decided to stay in the territory." Luke's heart jumped. "What did you tell her?" "I told her that would depend on whether you had the sense God gave a mule." Mrs. Garrett stood, brushing off her skirts. "The question is, Luke, do you?" After she left, Luke sat alone on his porch as darkness settled over the valley. In the distance, he could see lights beginning to appear in the windows of Timber Butte, including the boarding house where Rose was spending another night away from what had become their home. He thought about what Mrs. Garrett had said about Rose being in love with him. The possibility filled him with a mixture of hope and terror that he wasn't sure how to handle. If it was true, if Rose did love him, then everything changed. The careful distance he'd been maintaining, the assumption that their marriage was purely practical, the belief that he had nothing real to offer her, all of it would be built on false premises. But if Mrs. Garrett was wrong, if Luke misread the situation and declared feelings that Rose didn't share, he could destroy the friendship and respect they'd built together. Luke went inside and lit the lamp in his bedroom, then opened the tobacco tin that held the 2 wedding rings. Sarah's ring caught the lamplight, a circle of gold that had once symbolized their eternal commitment. His own ring lay beside it, recently removed, but still carrying the weight of 13 years of marriage. For the first time since Sarah's death, Luke could imagine a future that included both rings. Sarah's, preserved as a treasured memory, his own returned to his finger as a symbol of new promises made to a different woman. But first, he had to find the courage to discover whether Rose wanted to be that woman. Luke found Rose at Thomas Brennan's homestead on a Thursday morning, standing in the doorway of the modest house that would have been her home if fate had unfolded differently. She was dressed in her practical traveling clothes, her dark hair pinned back severely, and she was making notes in a small leather journal. "Rose," she turned at the sound of his voice, and Luke saw surprise flash across her face before she composed herself into careful neutrality. "Luke, what brings you here?" "I came to talk to you." Luke dismounted from Buckshot and approached slowly, as if she were a wild animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. "About us? About what happens next?" Rose closed her journal and tucked it into her coat pocket. "I assume you mean what happens next for me. You've made your position quite clear." "Have I?" Luke stopped a few feet away from her, close enough to see the shadows under her eyes that suggested she hadn't been sleeping well. "Because I'm not sure I understand my own position anymore." Rose's expression softened slightly, but she remained guarded. "What do you mean?" Luke looked around at the property that was now hers, the well-built house, the sturdy barn, the fenced pastures where Thomas Brennan's cattle grazed peacefully. It was a good homestead, the foundation for a prosperous life, and Rose had every right to claim it. I mean that when I told you to leave, when I said you deserved better than what I could give you, I wasn't thinking about what I wanted. I was thinking about what I thought was right, what I thought you should want. And now, Luke met her eyes, seeing the wariness there, but also something else, hope, perhaps carefully contained but unmistakably present. Now I'm trying to figure out whether I've been a fool, Rose, whether I've been so focused on protecting myself from loving again that I've missed what was right in front of me. Rose was quiet for a long moment, her gray eyes studying his face with the intensity he'd come to associate with her most serious thoughts. What exactly are you saying, Luke? The question was fair, and Luke realized he owed her complete honesty, even if it made him vulnerable in ways that terrified him. I'm saying that I don't want you to leave. I'm saying that these past few days without you have been harder than any days I've lived since Sarah died. I'm saying that somewhere along the way, you stopped being just a stranger I was helping and became essential to me. Rose's composure cracked slightly, and Luke saw her swallow hard before responding. Essential how? Luke took a step closer, encouraged by the fact that she didn't retreat. Essential like the sun coming up in the morning. Like having someone to share coffee with, someone to worry about when the weather turns bad, someone whose opinions matter to me and whose happiness feels connected to my own. That sounds like friendship, Luke. A close friendship, but friendship nonetheless. Does it? Luke reached into his coat pocket and withdrew the tobacco tin, holding it between them like an offering. Because I don't think friends spend sleepless nights wondering if they've made the biggest mistake of their lives by letting someone go. Rose's eyes fixed on the tin, recognition dawning. What are you doing with that? Luke opened the tin, revealing the 2 rings nestled inside. I'm trying to figure out what these mean now. Rose, Sarah's ring represents the past of love that shaped me, that I'll always be grateful for, but that belongs to what was rather than what could be. He lifted his own ring from the tin, holding it up to catch the morning light. This ring represents possibility, the chance to make new promises, to build something different, but equally real as someone who's become as important to me as breathing. Rose's eyes filled with tears, though she tried to blink them away. Luke, I can't be a replacement for Sarah. I won't try to be someone I'm not. I'm not asking you to replace her, Rose. I'm asking you to be yourself, to be the woman who brought my house back to life, who made me remember what it felt like to look forward to tomorrow. Luke took another step closer, close enough now to see the rapid rise and fall of Rose's breathing, the way her hands trembled slightly at her sides. I'm asking you to marry me, Rose. Not out of necessity this time, not to save your reputation or give you legal protection, but because I love you, because I want to build a life with you, a real marriage based on choice rather than circumstance. The words hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable and terrifying in their completeness. Luke felt exposed in a way he hadn't since. He was young, as if he'd handed Rose his heart, and was waiting to see whether she would treasure it or break it. Rose closed her eyes, tears spilling down her cheeks, despite her efforts to contain them. When she opened them again, Luke saw pain there, but also love unmistakable, undeniable love that made his chest tighten with hope. Oh, Luke, she whispered. I've wanted you to say that for weeks, but I was so afraid you'd never be able to see me as anything more than a convenience, a poor substitute for what you'd lost. Luke reached for her then, cupping her face in his hands and wiping away her tears with his thumbs. You're not a substitute for anything, Rose. You're not second best or second choice. You're the woman I fell in love with, without meaning to. The woman who made me understand that the heart is bigger than I thought, big enough to honor the past while embracing the future. Rose leaned into his touch, her eyes searching his face. Are you sure, Luke? Are you sure you're ready to let go of what you had with Sarah? Luke thought about the question, really considered it, rather than answering automatically. I'm not. "Letting go of what I had with Sarah," he said finally. "I'm letting go of the idea that loving her means I can't love anyone else. Sarah wanted me to be happy, Rose. She would have wanted me to find love again, to build a life that honored what we shared without being trapped by it." Rose stepped back from Luke's touch, not in rejection, but to give herself space to think clearly. Her hands shook as she reached into her coat pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. "I have something to show you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been carrying this around for 2 days, trying to decide what to do with it." Luke took the paper, recognizing it as one of the legal documents related to Rose's inheritance. But as he unfolded it, he saw that it wasn't the will or the property deed. It was a contract, freshly drawn up by the lawyers in Deadwood. "It's a sale agreement," Rose explained, "for Thomas's property. I can sell it back to the Territorial Land Office for enough money to buy passage anywhere I want to go, with plenty left over to start a new life." Luke felt his heart stop. "You're planning to leave the territory?" "I was considering it," Rose said honestly. "When I thought you saw our marriage as nothing more than a burden you'd taken on out of duty, when I thought I'd always be living in Sarah's shadow, it seemed like the kindest thing to do for both of us." Luke stared at the contract, seeing his worst fears laid out in legal language. "What changed your mind?" Rose smiled through her tears. "Mrs. Garrett. She told me yesterday that she'd never seen a man look at a woman the way you look at me when you think no one's watching. She said I'd be a fool to run away from love just because it came in a package I wasn't expecting." Luke felt a rush of gratitude toward the meddling older woman who'd apparently been orchestrating this moment from behind the scenes. "She was right," he said, setting the contract aside. "About how I look at you, about what I feel. Rose, these past months haven't been about duty or obligation. They've been about falling in love so gradually, so naturally, that I didn't realize it was happening until I thought I might lose you." Rose reached for his hands, intertwining their fingers with the familiarity of months of shared domesticity and the tenderness of new understanding. "I love you too, Luke," she said simply. "I think I started loving you the night you married me to save my life, when you looked at me with such kindness, despite being a complete stranger, and I've been falling deeper ever since." Luke felt something break open in his chest, a dam of emotion that had been holding back for 3 years. He pulled Rose into his arms, holding her tight against him as if he could keep her safe from all the uncertainties that had nearly driven them apart. "We're going to do this right," he murmured against her hair. "A real wedding with the whole town invited, with vows we choose ourselves." Rose pulled back to look at him, her face radiant with joy. "What about the rings?" Luke opened the tobacco tin again, lifting out his wedding band. "I'd like to wear this one again, if you'll have me. But first, I think we need new rings, Rose. Rings that belong to us, to what we're building together." "What about Sarah's ring?" Luke looked at the delicate gold band that had adorned his first wife's finger. "I think it should stay here," he said, gesturing to the tin. "Safe, treasured, but separate from what we're creating. Sarah deserves to be remembered and honored, but she doesn't need to be part of our daily life together." Rose nodded, understanding the significance of his decision. "And Thomas's property?" Luke considered the question, thinking about the practical implications of their union. "That's your choice to make, Rose. But if you're asking my opinion, I think you should keep it. Merge it with mine. Build something bigger and better than either of us could manage alone." "Our ranch," Rose said, testing the words. "Our home. Our future," Luke agreed. They rode back to town together, stopping at the blacksmith's shop where Luke commissioned 2 new wedding bands to be forged from Dakota gold. A blacksmith, a burly man named Henderson, who was cousin to Doc Henderson, promised to have them ready within the week dot at the boarding house. Rose packed her few belongings while Luke waited outside, giving her privacy, but also making it clear that he wasn't letting her out of his sight again. When she emerged with her traveling bag, she looked like a woman who'd made peace with her choices. "There's one more thing," Rose said as they prepared to leave town. "I wrote another letter to my sister, telling her the truth about everything, about Thomas's death, about our arrangement, about falling in love with my husband of convenience." Luke smiled at the phrase. "What did you tell her?" "I told her that sometimes the most unexpected paths lead to the most extraordinary destinations, and that I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." The ride back to their ranch for Luke, now thought of it as theirs, was different from any journey they'd taken together. There was an ease between them, a sense of rightness that came from finally acknowledging what had been growing between them for months. As they crested the hill that gave the first view of the valley, Rose reached over and took Luke's hand. "It's beautiful," she said, just as she had on their first night together. "But now it feels like home." Luke squeezed her hand, thinking about all the changes that lay ahead, combining their properties, planning a real wedding, building a life based on love rather than necessity. "Welcome home, Mrs. McCrae," he said, and this time the title felt exactly right. 6 months later, Luke stood in his kitchen, watching Rose through the window as she hung laundry on the line behind the house. The September morning was crisp with the promise of autumn, and Rose moved with the confident efficiency of a woman completely at home in her surroundings. The transformation had been remarkable, not just in Rose, but in everything around them. The combined properties now operated as one of the most successful ranches in the territory, with Rose's inheritance providing the capital for improvements that Luke had only dreamed about. They'd built additional pasture fencing, expanded the barn, and even installed a windmill that provided fresh water for both the house and the livestock. But the changes that mattered most to Luke were smaller, more personal. The way Rose hummed while she worked, filling the house with the kind of music he'd missed since Sarah's death. The way she'd rearranged the furniture to accommodate both their belongings, creating space for Sarah's memory while making room for their own traditions. The way she laughed at his dry humor and challenged his assumptions and made him feel more fully alive than he had in years. Their real wedding had taken place in June, with the entire population of Timber Butte in attendance, and enough food to feed twice as many people. Rose had worn a dress made from fabric she'd ordered from Philadelphia, a creation of ivory silk and delicate lace that had made Luke forget how to breathe when he saw her walking down the aisle of the little church. The ceremony itself had been everything their first wedding hadn't been: joyful, celebratory, attended by friends who understood exactly what they were witnessing. When Preacher Mills had pronounced them husband and wife, Luke had kissed Rose with the passion and promise of a man who knew exactly what he was claiming and what he was offering in return. The wedding rings they'd exchanged were simple bands of Dakota gold, inscribed with their initials and their true wedding date. Luke wore his proudly, no longer seeing it as a betrayal of his past, but as an affirmation of his future. Now, as he watched Rose pin one of his shirts to the line, Luke marveled at how naturally she'd adapted to frontier life. The city girl who'd arrived half frozen in a snowdrift had become a woman who could handle ornery cattle, preserve vegetables for winter, and negotiate with traveling merchants with the shrewdness of someone born to the business. She'd also proven to have a gift for hospitality that had made their ranch a gathering place for neighbors and travelers. Their dinner table frequently hosted other ranch families, circuit preachers, and anyone else who needed a meal and a place to rest. Rose had a way of making people feel welcome that reminded Luke of Sarah, but with her own unique warmth. Sound of approaching hoofbeats drew Luke's attention to the front of the house, where Doc Henderson was dismounting from his horse with the careful movements of a man whose joints were beginning to protest the demands of frontier travel. "Morning, Luke," Doc called as he approached the front door. "Is Rose around? I've got some news I think she'll want to hear." Luke stepped onto the porch, gesturing toward the backyard. "She's hanging laundry. What kind of news?" Doc's weathered face creased into a smile. The kind that's going to make you both very happy, I suspect. Rose appeared around the corner of the house, wiping her hands on her apron and smiling at their visitor. Doc Henderson, what brings you out our way? Official business, my dear, Doc said, reaching into his medical bag and withdrawing an envelope. Got word from that sister of yours back in Philadelphia. She's planning a visit. Wants to meet this husband of yours she's heard so much about. Rose's face lit up with excitement as she took the letter. Luke knew how much she missed her family, how difficult it had been to build a new life so far from everything familiar. Catherine's coming here? Rose asked, tearing open the envelope with eager fingers. When? According to that letter, she'd be on the train that arrives in Deadwood next month, Doc replied. Planning to stay through the holidays, from what I understand. Luke watched Rose read the letter, noting the way her free hand moved unconsciously to rest on her still flat stomach. It was a gesture she'd been making more frequently lately, though she hadn't yet said anything to Luke about what he suspected. She was beginning to suspect herself. There's something else, Doc continued, his tone becoming more professional. Rose, when was your last monthly course? Rose looked up from the letter, a blush coloring her cheeks. It's been some time. I was wondering if I should come see you about it. Doc nodded sagely. I think that would be a good idea. In fact, why don't I examine you now? Save you a trip to town. 20 minutes later, Doc emerged from the house with the satisfied expression of a man who just delivered good news. Luke, who'd been pacing the front porch like an expectant father, which, he realized, he might actually be stopped mid-stride. Well? He asked. Congratulations, Luke, Doc said, shaking his hand warmly. You're going to be a father come spring. Rose is about 2 months along, healthy as a horse and glowing like a lantern. Luke felt his knees go weak with a combination of joy and terror. A baby. After all the years of hoping with Sarah, after accepting that fatherhood might never be part of his story, he was going to have a child with Rose. Is everything all right? He managed. Everything's perfect, Doc assured him. Rose is. Young, strong, and she's got the best medical care in the territory. Not to mention a husband who'll take excellent care of her. Luke found Rose sitting in their bedroom, her hands resting on her stomach and tears of joy streaming down her cheeks. When she saw him, she smiled through her tears and held out her arms. We're going to have a baby, Luke, she whispered as he gathered her close. A spring baby. Luke held her tight, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they'd built together. From a marriage of necessity, born in a blizzard to this moment of perfect happiness. It seemed like more blessing than any one man deserved. Are you happy? Rose asked, pulling back to study his face. Happy doesn't begin to cover it, Luke replied. Terrified, grateful, amazed, overjoyed, but happy is definitely part of it. That evening, they sat on their front porch watching the sun set over the valley that was now completely theirs. Rose's head rested on Luke's shoulder, and his hand covered hers where it lay on her growing belly. Do you think Sarah would approve? Rose asked quietly. Of us, of the baby, of how happy we are. Luke considered the question, thinking about the woman who'd taught him how to love completely and who would have wanted nothing more than his continued happiness. I think Sarah would be delighted, he said finally. She always said this house needed the sound of children's laughter. She would have loved you, Rose, and she would have been the best grandmother any child could ask for. Rose squeezed his hand. I wish I could have known her. In a way, you do know her, Luke said. Every time you use one of her recipes, every time you tend her garden, every time you make this house feel like a home, you're carrying on what she started. That's the best kind of memory. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Luke thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. The grief that had nearly destroyed him, the chance encounter that had changed everything, the slow growth of love that had surprised them both with its depth and durability. Rose had been right that day, months ago, when she'd suggested that perhaps he didn't need to let go of his love for Sarah, but simply make room for something new alongside it. His heart had proven to be more expansive than he'd imagined, capable of honoring the past while embracing the future. The combined deed to their property sat framed on the mantel inside, a legal document that represented far more than mere ownership. It was proof that two people could build something together that was greater than the sum of its parts. That love could grow in the most unexpected soil and flourish beyond all reasonable expectation. In the spring, when their child was born, Luke would plant a tree in the yard, not to replace the one that marked Sarah's grave, but to stand alongside it as a symbol of new life, new hope, new love. The past and the future, growing together in the Dakota soil that had taught him that the heart, like the land itself, was capable of infinite renewal. "What are you thinking about?" Rose asked, noting his contemplative silence. Luke smiled, tightening his arms around the woman who'd given him back his life. "Tomorrow," he said simply, "and how much I'm looking forward to it." Above them, the first stars of autumn glittered in the vast Dakota sky, and the wind carried the promise of seasons yet to come. Years of shared mornings and quiet evenings, of challenges met and joys multiplied by the simple miracle of not facing them alone. Luke McCrae had learned that sometimes the most important journeys begin not with careful planning, but with unexpected encounters. That the heart's capacity for love is not diminished by loss, but deepened by it. And that the word home can mean something entirely new when spoken in the right company. In the distance, Coyote called to its mate, and Rose stirred contentedly in Luke's arms. Tomorrow would bring its own demands and possibilities, but tonight was perfect in its completeness, two lives joined, a future taking shape, and love proving once again that it could bloom in the bleakest winter and flourish. Beyond all reasonable hope,